Hey everyone, I'm Ellie Tahoney. I'd like to thank you for joining our Alliance discussion today, and it's going to be a really good one. I'm very excited about this one. Listen, if your organization is not a Research America member, I know that I sound like a broken record. I hope you'll shoot Joel, our Director of Development, an email or give him a call and talk about joining our alliance. I think we do great work. I know that I'm biased, but we really value your involvement. So I believe his contact info is in the chat, and yeah, do make use of it if you would. Second, if you wouldn't mind typing your questions into the Q&A box or chat, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can during that portion of the discussion today. So on to the good part. We are joined by Dr. David Ridley. He is the expert behind the development of priority review vouchers. And I'm not going to go into detail about what those are, because that's why we have David with us. He's going to do a quick PRV 101 and share his thoughts on the future of these incentives and the potential expansion of them. Some questions that are really front and center in Congress right now, actually, about priority review vouchers. So, David, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, over to you.
Ellie, thanks so much for that kind introduction. As I'll talk about in a moment, you were a really important part of the Priority Review Voucher program. So it's a delight for me to get to be here with you and also to speak to your audience. This is an important group of people, and I'm delighted to get to reach them in this way. So as Ellie said, I'm going to talk about Priority Review Vouchers. This is our 2006 paper that became law in 2007. So Jeff, Henry, and I published this paper in Health Affairs in 2006. It became law the following year. How did that happen so quickly? Why only 1 year? Well, a reporter told me about some senators that would like this. So something that was very helpful was that Health Affairs had a press conference at the National Press Club, and I got to talk about the paper. And a reporter from Congressional Quarterly told me about some senators that would be interested. Those senators were on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. They had great staff. And on the Republican side, it was Senator Brownback. On the Democrat side, it was Sherrod Brown. And working for Sherrod Brown was Ellie Tahoney. So Ellie Tahoney used to work for Senator Brown. So she knows this program very well and was one of the early people involved with this. The other things that helped it happen so quickly was that there was must-pass legislation in 2007. So every 5 years, user fees have to be reauthorized, and so there's a must-pass bill. And also, Congress didn't have to come up with any funding to pay for it. So that certainly helps if you don't have to come up with new money. Okay, so what is the Priority Review Voucher? I think many of you will know what this is, but just a reminder is useful. People often get confused that it's priority review for the tropical disease drug. It is. That drug gets priority review, but the important component is there's a second drug that gets priority review, and that's what creates the commercial value. So actually, let me bring up my laser pointer here. So if you develop a drug for, say, sleeping sickness or Chagas, or a rare pediatric disease or a medical countermeasure, you get a voucher for faster review of a different drug, say an HIV drug or diabetes or cholesterol or migraine, and you can sell that voucher. And recently, vouchers have been selling for about $100 million each. And that creates a reward for this good deed. And it makes it easier for that company to get funding from investors. Hey, you think this drug is going to be a money loser, but because of the voucher program, we think we can make a little bit of money or at least break even. So again, a reminder, 2 drugs for every voucher. The first drug is not expected to be profitable in general, although there are some rare pediatric disease drugs that are profitable. But certainly for the tropical diseases, they are not expected to be profitable. And the medical countermeasures are for diseases for which we hope no one will ever have. for diseases like smallpox, which have been eradicated. So you do the good deed, the drug that's probably not profitable, and in return, you get faster review of the drug that will be profitable. And because it's a tradable voucher, these don't have to be held by the same company. So priority review does not shorten clinical trials. Don't confuse it with accelerated approval or fast track pathways that might speed this. It's just shortening this. It's just shortening FDA time from about 10 months to about 6 months. And with the shorter FDA time means potentially more years of sales. At minimum, it means earlier sales, but potentially more years of sales. You see here a list of eligible diseases. If the disease does not have parentheses after it, it was one of the original diseases in the 2007 law. If it has parentheses, it was added later. One of the questions that Ellie and Jacqueline and her colleagues sent me was, how are diseases added to this list? There's two mechanisms. Number one, the FDA can add the disease. The FDA can say, for example, with Chagas, like this was an obvious disease that should have been on the original list, somehow got left off. Not sure why. I think it's entirely possible that this trypanosomiasis was confused with that American trypanosomiasis was confused with African trypanosomiasis. I'm not sure, but it got left off and it got added later. Other diseases like Ebola, we were just not as aware of at the time of the article and of the time of the law. So FDA can add diseases, and you can see Congress can add diseases. Another question that Ellie and her colleagues sent me was about, have there been changes to the voucher program over time? One is the addition of diseases, but also when we worked with Senator Burr and his staff, again, with Health, Education, Labor, and Pension at Senate, when we added Ebola, we also got another fix, which was shortening the notification time at the FDA. One of the bigger mistakes we made with our original paper was we said that you need to give the FDA 1 year notice before using your voucher for that second drug. The problem with that is your drug's still in clinical trials. You don't know if you've got a good drug or not. So you may say to FDA, we're going to use a voucher on this drug, and then you get your clinical trial results back and it's a bad drug. So that was a bad idea on our parts. We fixed that in 2014 when Ebola was added. So now you only have to give the FDA 3 months notice that you're going to use the voucher. By then you have your phase 3 data back. Okay, the biggest addition on this list was rare pediatric diseases in 2012, but also medical countermeasures were added in 2016. But as you'll see in a moment, a lot of the vouchers have been for rare pediatric diseases. Here's that moment. So you see that initially the vouchers were just for neglected tropical diseases. You also see that the voucher program started slowly. These diseases are called neglected for a reason. The tropical diseases are legitimately neglected. Why did this take so long? 2 reasons. The most obvious reason is clinical trials take time. Phase 1 takes 2 years, phase 2 takes 2 years, phase 3 takes 2 years. And FDA review takes time, so that's 7 years. So R&D takes time. Second reason is embarrassingly, there was limited awareness of the voucher program early on. Some economists at Duke came up with this idea, and it just wasn't that well known at the start. That's why organizations like Research America are helpful partners for us to help us get the word out on things. But you can see things picked up later. After some time, we got 4 vouchers for tropical diseases, but then it tailed off later. Why did it tail off later? I think because there were so many vouchers for rare pediatric diseases, so a lot of success in that space, and the voucher price came down. I'll talk to you more about the voucher price in just a moment. One of the questions that Ellie sent me was about impact, and this slide is an awful slide, forgive me. I just made this morning and just made a laundry list, but I'll just say this real quickly and please forgive the ugly slide. So the voucher helped a nonprofit developer, in this case it was Medicines Development for Global Health out of Australia, led by Mark Sullivan, attract investment for their river blindness drug. It provided a commercial rationale for continued development of a TB drug, tuberculosis drug. It supported patient access to a Chagas drug through the sale of a voucher. Mundo Sano and Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, DNDi, were involved in that one. According to a GAO report, it influenced development for all 7 developers that GAO interviewed. There's a paper by Wong et al., I reference it at the bottom, 2019 Health Affairs, that showed that for rare pediatric diseases, it increased the rate of rare pediatric diseases transitioning from phase 1 studies to phase 2 studies with 95% confidence. It increased the rate of rare pediatric disease drugs going from phase 2 to phase 3 with 90% confidence. Now, 90% confidence is kind of a no-no. That's below 95%. So we're not supposed to say that's statistically significant, but so that's weak evidence. Not sure, but it's weak evidence that it helped in that transition. We did not then see an increase in phase 3 to approval, but that makes sense because, again, like I just said, if you've gone through phase 3, now it's just the science. It's not the economic incentive. You're at the end of the game. And so the question is, did the drug work? And so it shouldn't affect that. Okay, and finally, maybe 1 or 2 more. Is that finally? Yeah, 2 more. It rewarded the development of smallpox drugs, which we hope we'll never need, but it turns out we did need them when monkeypox broke out. So that was part of medical countermeasures. And finally, something we don't really think about here is that second drug got to market faster. That cholesterol drug, that HIV drug, that diabetes drug. One of those drugs is Gilead's Biktarvy, which is awesome HIV combination drug. Patients got earlier access to that. It would have been reviewed by FDA in 10 months. Instead, it was reviewed by FDA in 6 months, approximately. What are the concerns about the voucher program? That was one of the questions that Ellie sent me. One is access. Will poor patients get the new drugs? Fortunately, in the tropical disease space, we've seen a lot of success. There are exceptions. There's a little company that developed a leishmaniasis drug, sold the second voucher, has not done a good job of getting its drug out to patients. But for the most part, companies have done a great job with this. For many of them, it's their mission. I mentioned Mundo Sano and DNDi. I mean, it's their mission. They're nonprofits. They're trying to do good in the world. But also the bigger companies, they're not in this for the money. GSK and Novartis and Sanofi are not developing drugs for these diseases because it's going to be profitable. They want to make their employees proud. And their employees are going to be embarrassed if they're not good about getting the drug out to people. There have been some tensions. Johnson & Johnson has been criticized for enforcing patents, not charging prices that are low enough for its tuberculosis drug. It was charging $2 a dose. Doctors Without Borders wanted $1 a dose. Advocates have wanted no defensive patents. J&J recently came around and said they would do that. So J&J losing money, I suspect, on Bedaquiline and now losing even more money. But there's a benefit to J&J. There's a benefit to GSK. There's a benefit to Novartis. And that is their employees can feel proud that they're making a difference for these diseases. Some people might feel embarrassed to work for a drug maker. Drug makers tend to get bad publicity. It's nice when you can sit at the dinner table with your cousins and your aunts and uncles and say to them, I work for a company that's giving away drugs for river blindness. I work for a company that developed the first drug for this disease, and we're making sure that patients get it. So for a lot of these larger companies with deeper pockets, a big reason why they do this is to try to make their employees proud. They have they're talented people, have a choice they can work for organizations. They want to work for the organization that makes them feel proud or at least not embarrassed. Okay, the second problem is we've had a lot of vouchers. I mean, it's a good problem, a lot of vouchers, but the bad news is the price has fallen. In our original paper, we predicted a price of about $300 million for vouchers, and the market did reach $300 million, but then we got more vouchers than we expected. We didn't anticipate the expansion of rare pediatric diseases, and that, or the medical countermeasures, although there haven't been that many medical countermeasures vouchers, and that the greater supply has meant lower prices. So the price has been about 100 million. So you can see that here. And in fact, we wrote a paper. So Stefan Rennie and I wrote this paper in 2016 and said, hey, this could fall to 100 million. And then it did. And I think that's because of supply and demand. I hope it's not because Stefan and I talked the price down. But you can see initially the price was not very high. People were cautious at first. Do you really want to buy this piece of paper? you want to be the dummy that pays 300 million for a piece of paper that may do nothing? So there was concern initially, but it did reach, there were a couple sales above 300 million, as we predicted in the paper, but then we got a lot of vouchers and the price came down. Fortunately, the voucher price has been pretty stable at 100 million. Again, here you see the supply of vouchers and you see the price changing over time. Will the Senate add more vouchers? So again, if the Senate adds vouchers, then we're going to get greater quantity of vouchers and the price is going to come down further. So I just wanted to raise your awareness on this. So one of the leaders on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee on the Republican side is interested in how can we reduce drug shortages. Drug shortages are a serious problem. You may have heard of some of the shortages of some of the generic cancer drugs. It's a serious problem, and I'm glad the Health Committee is taking it seriously. But I hope the solution will not be expansion of the voucher program for a variety of reasons. I think there are better mechanisms to preventing shortages. I think we get some vouchers awarded to companies that were going to end shortages anyway. And I think it's too much of a reward for ending a shortage. $100 million voucher, well, the price would probably come down. So that's bad news for those of you working on rare pediatric diseases or medical countermeasures or tropical diseases. If there are more vouchers, your reward will come down. You'll be less able to help those sick children and other people suffering from those diseases. So I hope the Senate Health Committee will move on to other options for addressing drug shortages. And I don't think there's much awareness of this, so I hope you'll help get the word out. It's well-meaning. The person who originally proposed this is a supporter of the voucher program, and I really appreciate that. But I think in this case, there are better mechanisms. Okay, so I talked to you about the Priority Review Voucher Program, which became our 2006 paper, became law in 2007. It gives you faster review at the FDA. That idea, you do a good deed, you get faster review of a commercial product. That general idea we've recommended in 3 settings. The one I just described to you. We've also recommended this to the European Medicines Agency. We wrote a paper in The Lancet in 2011 proposing this, and we're currently working on a project to follow up on that. And I'll be in Brussels in November talking to some leaders in Europe about that potential. Right now, Europeans are more excited about patent extensions as a reward, and some of you drug developers will all likewise be more excited about patent extensions as a reward. That's real money. I mean, that's billions of dollars, not 100 million. So the good news about that is that's real money. The bad news about that is it delays generic entry. So if that failed, and actually that was being considered in the Senate 20 years ago. Our idea was kind of a derivative of that. Rather than give you more patent, get you on the market earlier. Don't delay generics. Anyway, the idea of a patent extension is being debated in Europe right now. If that fails, we hope they'll consider a priority review voucher. Okay, and then one more setting outside of drugs into the pesticide space. One of the great ways to control malaria and Zika and other diseases carried by vectors is to provide better chemicals for the bed nets, chemicals that are safe and that will last a while on the bed net or on the walls. We proposed in a 2017 paper that became law in December that if you develop a new pesticide that protects against those pests that carry these diseases, you get faster review at the EPA for your herbicide, and you can sell that voucher. So I don't know how many of you are in that space, but that became law very recently, became law in December. Okay. Back to the exclusivity voucher briefly. So don't confuse these, because this is, the Europeans are considering a reward, do a good deed, you get longer patent life, exclusivity life. That's being, ours is do a good deed, shorten your review time, get to market earlier. This is more valuable. Exclusivity vouchers are more valuable. Your drug has already hit $5 billion in annual sales, and you're going to keep that going a little longer. That is more valuable. But it's delaying generics. Okay, there's my webpage, which I'm not great about updating, but there is a pretty decent video on there, and I'm behind on keeping up on my data. And Ellie, I will peer at the Q&A and the chat also.
Oh, yeah. You know what? I was just responding, and I need to respond to Santi because I responded with the wrong answer. Santi, we can't share these particular slides, but I definitely would recommend David's website at Duke. It has wonderful information in plain English on this, just like the slide deck does. David, we have a lot of very cool questions. There's one that's there are a couple of questions that I think are looking at the same kind of, they're on the same theme. A couple that came in before this discussion, and then one that's in the Q&A, and it has to do with adding, I think, fungal infections, particularly valley fever, potentially to the list of neglected tropical diseases. And I think the backstory is that FDA declined to add valley fever to the list because there was thought that there was a commercial market for the vaccine in the US. And in fact, valley fever is very much like Chagas. There is an incidence in the US. Whether a vaccine would be meet with the market failure is another question. So I guess the question there is there a way that FDA will accept reconsiderations, right? You can ask for a reconsideration by FDA for adding a medicine to, a condition to the rare disease, the neglected tropical disease voucher, and the other voucher programs, right?
Yeah, so that was a great answer, Ellie. So the two pathways are FDA and Congress. And as Ellie said, if you failed at FDA, you can take another crack at FDA. And then your other pathway is Congress. You know, I said earlier I was worried about expansion of the voucher program. I wouldn't really worry about valley fever because that would just be one additional disease, maybe one or two additional vouchers wouldn't really affect supply and demand that much. But I don't know enough about valley fever to know whether, as you said, there's a market failure there or whether it's potentially has some returns. Also, Ellie, can I address one of the questions I see in the chat?
Oh, absolutely.
You know, one person said, can it really be valuable going from 10 months to 6 months? I mean, it's 4 months.
Richard Turman, our friend Richard. Yeah.
It's a fabulous question. And so the answer is it depends. For the average drug, it's probably not worth 100 million. But there are top-selling drugs for which it would be very valuable. I mentioned Biktarvy earlier, the HIV combination drug. That drug has been a multi-billion-dollar seller. And the voucher for that drug was worth much more than 100 million. Why is that worth so much? So see if I can do a plot. Maybe actually, let me just see if I can draw a picture. So
what fun.
So we'll see. This is probably going to be awful, but I'll just scratch around for a minute. And so this is time, and this is money. And so your drug sales would do something like this over time. And I've forgotten how to change colors, but I guess I won't change it. It just went away.
We're bipartisan. We need or non-partisan.
Yeah, I know.
Blue. We need blue now.
Let's see if I can figure out. I got to move my. I don't know where all my tools are.
This is super cool, though. We need really nice discussions with pictures.
Let's see, whiteboard. Okay. Well, I just lost my cool because I don't see all of my tools for drawing here like I used to. Okay, well, we'll start with that. So that's your sales over time. And what I want you to imagine is shifting that curve to the left. So that curve moves forward. And then I want you to think of verticals at every point. At every point in your drug's life cycle, you're now going to be making more money. So it's not just for 4 months that you're going to be making money. Those first 4 months of sales, you're going to move up your sales curve faster. So the key point here is most drugs don't immediately jump up to massive sales. They take time to develop. And so what you're doing is you're moving that forward. And by moving it forward, you're making more money in every period because you're higher up than you would have been.
Right. I've just got to say, this reminds me so much of my first scary economics class. I can't even tell you. And I was an economics major. David, you know what? I think you're on a roll. Do you want to keep looking at what's in the A's that are in the chat for us, and we'll just go from there?
Yeah, I'd love to. So there was a recent article in the Pink Sheet. Sharon mentions that there are a lot of vouchers sitting out there and wondering what's going on. I think so I don't know. But I think there are a lot of companies. So first of all, if a big company wins a voucher, they almost never sell it. I can't think of any examples where a big company has won a voucher and sold it. They just sit on it until a drug comes through the pipeline that has sufficient value to use it. Why don't they ever sell it? For a variety of reasons. I think the most important is that there are tax implications if you sell it. So if you sell it, you pay taxes on it potentially. If you use it internally, you don't. Secondarily, it does seem like an admission that we got nothing in our pipeline, or nothing in our pipeline nothing in our pipeline that would be standard worth accelerate or worth speeding. So big companies are just going to sit on the vouchers potentially for years. They're not, they don't. Unfortunately, for the big companies, they don't have a great new drug coming out with standard review that needs priority review every year. So for one thing, big companies are sitting on the vouchers. Now, the scary thing would be that if they're small companies having trouble selling them. Although I do like the fact that the voucher prices have held pretty steadily. There have been an occasion where it has dipped below 100 million. In part, those were companies kind of doing a fire sale, rushing to sell them. So part of this may be patience on the part of the small companies waiting to sell, wanting to hit that $100 million number-ish. But I think a huge part of it is the big companies that either won a voucher and are waiting for the next drug to come down the pipeline, or went ahead and bought a voucher at a time when they had a lot of cash and want to use it at a time when they don't. So drug makers' revenues can fluctuate. Pfizer's jumped up real big thanks to its COVID vaccine and are on their way down. Gilead, which I mentioned, their Biktarvy HIV drug, their revenue skyrocketed with their hepatitis C drugs. And then they got competition, and then they cured a bunch of people and their revenues fell. So drug makers may want to buy when they're flush with cash. And so there may be some advantage of using money when you got it. Often with the cash, they'll acquire a company or acquire a molecule, but in this case, you acquire a voucher and then use it later.
David, do you see the one from William Jones about there being no specific list for rare pediatric diseases?
Yeah.
Is it an orphan drug? If they qualify as an orphan pediatric product, is that how they're?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's two questions. Number one, is this a rare disease? And number two, is this a pediatric disease? And I'm not with FDA, I'm not a regulator, and I'm not a lawyer. But so I don't know much. But my understanding is that you need to demonstrate those to the FDA. So they don't have the epidemiologists that are going to crunch the numbers and say, is this really rare? Are there really fewer than 200,000 Americans? You have to prove to the FDA. So the criteria for an orphan or rare disease is fewer than 200,000 Americans. You have to demonstrate that. And number two, you have to demonstrate that it's pediatric. That's a non-trivial question. There was debate recently about whether sickle cell disease is pediatric. So it's clearly pediatric if it onsets when you're a child and then the children don't live into adulthood. That is clearly pediatric. But what if some fortunate children survive into adulthood? Do we still classify it as pediatric? And in what shares? That's up to the FDA and you. That's up to you to demonstrate. It's up to the FDA. The FDA did decide that, as I recall, that sickle cell disease is eligible as a rare pediatric disease. I hope I'm getting that right. Please
hope,
consult your
yeah.
lawyer.
It's so tricky because this is about whether there's a market failure and a voucher's needed and what the law says. And, so it's tricky. William, I'm so glad that you brought up that topic. Boy, there are a lot of questions.
So why so I'll take Rachel asked, why do you think it takes so much time to get a law in the European Union? A couple thoughts on that. First of all, in the United States, we got the Orphan Drug Act in the early 80s. I think Europe added the Orphan Drug Act in the early 90s, and then Japan added the Orphan Drug Act in the late 90s. So I'm proud to say that sometimes the United States is a leader in these things. Not always, but with the Orphan Drug Act, we saw that Europeans followed later. In this case, I think the reason is that that the European Union has not had that much authority with regard to the pharmaceutical market in the past. So FDA just has more authority, let's say, than the European Medicines Agency and the European Union more broadly. Its mandate was more narrow. However, COVID changed that. So with COVID, the European Union member states realized that there's greater value in cooperation, there's greater value in more centralization and more authority. And so COVID and the changing relationship with the European Union toward pharmaceuticals has created an opportunity for more action in this space. Yeah. So a big part of the explanation why now is because things changed with COVID. A lot of things changed with COVID. Work from home, that but the European Union's mandate with regard to drugs.
David, can I ask a quick question? I'm going to jump in here for a second. Back to the generic, the idea of generic PRVs, and I think it's an important topic. Because it also goes to the phenomena that I think it's documented that there are just fewer generic applications that are coming into FDA. And I'm sorry, I was trying to respond to Richard's question while you were finishing up on talking about generics.
Yeah. But
isn't it a different regulatory pathway altogether at FDA? So why would generic PRVs affect the market for brand PRVs?
It's a great question. So in this case, as I understand the proposal, it's a key question. We need to check this, Ellie. But my understanding is if you do the good deed, usually that good deed is tropical disease or whatever, you get a typical priority review voucher.
I see.
You're getting not priority review for generics, but for brands. Because priority review for a generic drug would
not have a big value.
Generic drugs aren't very profitable. Right. So my understanding, I'm glad you asked this question because I should double check, but I'm 80% sure that these are typical priority review vouchers. You end the shortage, you get a priority review for your branded cholesterol drug.
You're absolutely right. That's got to be the case. And we only have you for 5 more minutes, but I think we are going to just keep harassing you till we get a part 2 to this. When you because there clearly is interest, and I love this topic.
Me too. Can I grab another question?
Yes, please.
So I see Rebecca's question about the value for nonprofits and academics. I've seen a couple of examples of this. I've seen a nonprofit and I've seen an academic. So the example I saw with the nonprofit was Mark Sullivan.
What was the question? I'm missing the question.
Yeah. So this is from Rebecca. What's the value proposition, if any, to nonprofits and academics who license their intellectual property at an early stage to a partner? So I'm going to answer indirectly, and then I'll answer more directly. So first of all, indirectly, Mark Sullivan got funding from investors to move his drug forward, and then he and the investors decided how they would share the voucher. So Mark Sullivan's a not-for-profit in Australia working on the river blindness drug. My colleague at Duke was working on a biologic for DeGeorge syndrome, which affects 20 children in the United States each year. Not very profitable, but it's a miracle biologic that if kids get it, they live, and if kids don't get it, they die. So it's an incredible product. You can run a pretty small clinical trial when it's so obvious, but although they did have problems with their clinical trials, but in part because they changed their process midway and FDA.
Oh, it always is. That's always trouble.
But she was able to get funding from Roivant, a drug maker slash investor, to move her product forward, and in return they got the voucher. So in both cases, a nonprofit and academic were able to get funding from investors because of the promise that the investor would get a return from the voucher. Okay, now, but more directly, Rebecca's question is, what if you license your technology to a drug maker? So the answer is it depends. You can consider in your contract that you say that we get some milestone payment. If the product gets approved, we get a payment. If the product gets a voucher, we get a payment. Not sure what that payment would be. Let's say $5 million, $10 million, but that can potentially be a useful reward for you to then fund your next project. One thing that Mark Sullivan was thinking about with his onchocerciasis drug in the anti-parasitic space was he would also want to work on scabies and other parasitic diseases. And so he wanted to also learn about the antiparasitic market, have some of those knowledge spillovers, and maybe also have a few more resources. That was actually also a related question that Ellie and colleagues sent me was, if we're encouraging development of these drugs, is that hurting those drugs? And I would say no. I don't think of it as a zero-sum game. I think it's a positive-sum game. Because if we're encouraging you to work on this stuff, then there are positive spillovers to the other stuff. If we're learning how to fight parasitic diseases, if we're learning how to fight viral diseases, if we're learning how to treat bacterial diseases, that can help us with other diseases that are related. And you see this, the companies working on these diseases are companies that are good at the other things also. There are these spillovers across these. And it doesn't even have to be in one, in the infectious disease space. Companies were working on the mRNA technology for cancer that spilled over and turned out to be great for the COVID vaccine.
Right.
So just our general knowledge of how to counter diseases, how to make molecules, to hit targets, our general knowledge, if we're working on this, our general knowledge grows and it helps that. So I don't see it as zero sum, I see it as positive sum.
I think you just articulated one of the most difficult things when you're trying to convey the value of medical progress. It is, cumulative, iterative. So that was just terrific. It's 11:38, David. We promised you 11:40. We're going to do a part 2 when your schedule permits. There's so many great questions, and we are going to record all these questions. I'm going to bring David back. Thank you, David, for this. Really, really appreciate it. Jacqueline, can you join us and David, you are off the hook officially. We're just going to talk about the next Alliance discussion, and we're going to have a part 2. I promise you guys.
Ellie, this has been such a pleasure. So nice to talk to you and your audience. And in the chat, I put priorityreviewvoucher.org. That has a pretty decent video that covers a lot of the stuff that we just covered.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Let's do it again. Thank you.
We will do. Stick with us, audience, for a second, because we just want to talk about our next Alliance discussions that are coming up. Jay?
Yes, thanks, Ellie. So if you are a Research America member, we hope you can join us next Wednesday on October 11th at noon Eastern. We'll have a quick check-in on what's happening or not in Congress. We'll discuss the continuing push and pull around FY24 funding and other R&D related developments with Capitol Hill veteran Mary D. Beal from KDCR Partners. Look out in your emails for the registration link if you're a Research America Alliance member. So
yeah,
thanks.
Do join us if you're a member. We really would love to brainstorm a little bit too about advocacy. we're coming up with a little bit of a mini advocacy campaign. Would love your input. So do join us. It's an Alliance member only off the record meeting. And if you're not an Alliance member, you have a week to join us. So bonus. Sorry, Jay, to interrupt. Go ahead.
No problem. I was all set here. So we look forward to seeing you all again soon and have a great afternoon.
Bye all.
Bye.